A little while ago I did a review of Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal, and I was really surprised by how much fun that game is. So I was quite excited to try out its sequel, Sonic Boom Fire and Ice. Shattered Crystal got some pretty bad reviews from the critics, and even I have to admit there were some areas where it could have been a little better. So did they use this sequel as a chance to improve? Let's find out. Fire and Ice is again made by Sanzaru Games. It's got a rubbish home screen icon, it doesn't even rotate. They made up for that with the start screen though. I love how it has the fire and the ice, or snow I guess, flowing around each other so dramatically. It's still got that adorable loading animation from the previous game too. Shattered Crystal had okay cutscenes, but a lot of them were just written dialogue, and although there were a few good jokes in there, most of the writing felt pretty low quality to me. Fire and Ice, on the other hand, not only has all of its cutscenes fully animated and voice acted, but it's also got writing that almost feels like it could have come straight out of the TV show. Well, aside from when it comes to the plot, that is. The plot's attempts to explain the existence of the game's mechanics feels pretty desperate. In fact, I think one of Tails' lines kind of acknowledges that.
Because science!
And the rest of it is just a generic stop Eggman from doing the thing storyline, but whatever. Something like Sonic Boom doesn't need much of a plot to it, it just needs the characters to be well written, and that they are. The cutscenes make this game feel as though it had a bigger budget to work with than Shattered Crystal did, although I've no idea whether or not that's true. I wonder if maybe Sanzaru got a bit more support from the studio that worked on the TV show this time round. The game starts you off in a winter area, which is kind of strange as most platformers start you off somewhere warm and vibrant to showcase how pretty the game is and make you excited to play more. Winter zones can easily end up looking bland because of all the white, so they're not a great way to show off your game. And if you're going to introduce ice physics at some point, it doesn't usually make sense to do so until the player has had time to get used to how the game feels without any ice. Anyway, the winter theming does work okay here, but it's still an odd decision to me. Maybe it was supposed to tie into the story somehow, but if so, they didn't make that clear enough. I wonder if maybe they just wanted to differentiate it from the start of the first game. Moving around on the world map feels really awkward. I often have to push the stick repeatedly to make Sonic move, and sometimes he goes the wrong way. Also, I noticed Sonic's idle animation on the map doesn't include blinking. The last one probably didn't either, but I didn't look at it long enough to notice. I looked at this one long enough though. I dried my eyes out waiting for that jerk to blink. Just blink, dang it! Blink! Getting into the actual gameplay, I noticed one or two nice little tweaks to improve it from Shattered Crystal. For instance, in that game, if you broke an object that has rings in it while you were running, you'd have to go back if you wanted to collect them, while in Fire and Ice it gives them to you automatically. The controls and physics feel very similar to Shattered Crystal. You still have that slightly odd feeling of losing a lot but not quite all of your momentum when you jump, and it still feels like you're following a slightly rigid path, and both of those things are still fine once you get used to them. The controls might be slightly tighter now, or maybe it's just that the animations have been done up slightly, or maybe I'm just crazy, I'm not really sure which. It can still be slightly finicky to get Sonic to air dash directly upwards or downwards, though I've definitely gotten better at pulling that off as I've played through the game. Hey, I wonder what this thing in the first level is. Wait, an ice fishing cave? Is this Big the Cat Arctic Edition? No, unfortunately not. It turns out it's just an obstacle course. You get one of these platforming challenge rooms in each level. They often push you to make good use of your momentum, which is an idea that I really like since, as I mentioned before, the momentum in these 2D Boom games feels quite unusual to me. You lose so much of your momentum when jumping that it feels like you're almost coming to a halt, yet you still carry enough that your speed before the jump can be the difference between a safe landing or falling into a bunch of spikes. What I found out more recently though is that you can sometimes keep way more momentum than usual. I think you do it by letting go of the boost button at exactly the same moment as hitting jump, but I find it really difficult to do consistently, which is a big issue in these challenge rooms as they often require you to execute these longer jumps perfectly. Well, they kind of require you to. For some reason they let you keep your special moves in these challenge rooms, so Sonic can still air dash, Tails can still fly, and Knuckles can still get a boost using his punches. These moves break a lot of the physics puzzles you're, I think, supposed to be figuring out. I'm honestly kind of confused as to what they intended with these levels. It kind of feels like your special moves should have been taken away, like in those sections in Mario Sunshine where FLUDD gets taken off you. But then again, I found some of those longer jumps such a pain that I actually appreciated having the option to use Sonic's air dash, especially in the earlier challenges. And yes, I said the earlier challenges. For some reason, the challenge rooms actually start out hard and get easier, before getting slightly harder again at the very end. The easier rooms are often pretty trivial if you let yourself use any of the boys' special moves, so I ended up playing a lot of them with sticks. I did sometimes use her boomerang to snag rings I dropped in a dangerous spot and sneak in an extra try, which made me feel pretty smug, so I'm glad that was left in. I think the challenge rooms are a good idea, but they would have worked a lot better if they took away your special moves, had a difficulty curve that made actual sense, and didn't have jumps that rely on you getting that finicky long jump right, or using air dashes, or at least made it so that the long jump was easier to get consistently. In Shattered Crystal, Amy was the only main character you couldn't play as. Instead, she served as the damsel in distress who had to be rescued. But in Fire and Ice, they managed to make all 5 of the heroes playable, Amy included. Amy's hammer moves feel good to do thanks to the great animations they're given, but they're only really useful for her gimmicks, which are these pillars that she can make sink down. Sometimes you get on one after knocking it down, and after a few seconds it lifts you up, but that's pretty much as complex as it gets. It's a pretty boring gimmick, especially as the pillars move painfully slowly. It's quite disappointing. Speaking of gimmicks, most of the returning gimmicks have been improved very slightly from the previous game. Knuckles' digging sections are now free from timers and have more obstacles. Sonic's autorunner levels and Tails' submarine sections have both been spruced up a little and made fully optional so you can just skip them. And Stick's boomerang sections are exactly the same. They're still sometimes slightly finicky, but I still think they're a decent inclusion. Most of the other gimmicks I just mentioned feel almost pointless to have in the game, although I guess they do add a little more variety to it than it would have had otherwise. Tails actually got some brand new gimmicks. For instance, he has a gun now. And for some reason that makes me very happy. Aiming it with the control stick feels a bit clunky though. It's functional, but it would have been better if you could use the touchscreen or tilt controls to aim. And I know tilt aiming doesn't sound great, but Woolly World proved it actually is, so there. There are still one or two of Tails' flight sections that demand a strangely high amount of precision. Tails' gun actually has a bit of recoil to it, so sometimes I quickly pointed it in the opposite direction to where I was trying to reach and fired it to get a little boost. It would have been nice if they'd done a little more with the paths Tails occasionally has to follow while he's floating down. The first tropical level has this cool moment where he needs to float down to a certain height and then throw in a double jump to get onto a platform, but that's about as interesting as it gets, unfortunately. Tails also now has these hovercraft levels, which are basically vertical shoot-em-ups. Why is he so violent in this game? These levels are so simple that I feel like they're hardly even worth talking about. They really didn't need to be in the game, but at the same time they're not exactly an issue. They don't drag on or anything, and you can just skip them all, you don't even have to play them. One thing I found funny was that if you get to the finish line but go to the left or right of the collectible, then instead of automatically collecting the item and finishing, you just hit an invisible wall, and the game just sits there waiting until you finally shift over to get it. In the previous game, you selected the character you wanted by pressing one of the 4 directions on the D-pad. Since there are 5 characters now, you use the touchscreen to select them instead, which at first I disliked because in Shattered Crystal I always wanted to have the map on the touchscreen to help me to navigate. But as it turns out, in this game you actually don't need to use the map very often because of how the main levels are designed. Which brings us to the biggest difference between Shattered Crystal and its sequel. Okay, I'm not sure how it took me this long to get around to talking about this, as the level design is really what defines Fire and Ice as being a completely different game from Shattered Crystal, despite clearly being made with a lot of the same code and assets. Shattered Crystal was all about exploration and finding collectibles. Fire and Ice still encourages you to explore a little bit, but its main focus is on speed and straightforward platforming. You don't stop as often for character gimmicks like Stick's Boomerang, and most of the collectibles are very easy to find. Some of them are basically just handed to you, and most of the others are on an alternative path that always brings you straight back to the main route after you get the item. You pretty much just have to remember to always go left first when you get to an intersection, and you'll end up finding most of the stuff. And while Shattered Crystal required you to get the collectibles in order to progress, in Fire and Ice there's very little motivation to get them, so if I do happen to miss a collectible while I'm playing, I usually just ignore it and carry on to the next level. The only thing I really made a point of finding was the challenge room, which I rarely missed even on my first try. The levels are pretty easy to beat. You won't find any sections that you have to play over and over to get good enough to get past them, although you do still have to pay attention if you want to keep a nice flow through the level, and I'd say that's where the fun in this game comes from. I enjoyed it most when I was using all of Sonic's moves to go as fast as I possibly could. The controls feel tight, and most of the levels have a nice rhythm to them, so it can be really pleasant just blasting through them. I imagine they removed the exploration in response to the poor reviews, and if you don't like that kind of gameplay, then I guess this is an improvement. But the thing is, the exploration is what made Shattered Crystal so interesting to me, and it's also what gave you a bit of a challenge in that game. I don't know of many platformers that have that much exploration without being a full-on Metroidvania, and while the more normal level design in Fire and Ice is a lot of fun, for me it isn't quite enough to completely make up for taking the exploration aspect away. Something Fire and Ice does have that wasn't in Shattered Crystal though is boss fights. They stretch across both of the 3DS screens so that the bosses can be tall and still have their incoming attacks clearly visible, and you automatically switch between Sonic and one of the other characters during the different phases of the fight, so you're always playing with whichever character has the ability you need. As I said when I was reviewing Shattered Crystal, there's a lot of potential for interesting boss fights with the mechanics and the rhythmic feel these games have. But unfortunately, I don't think the bosses in this game take full advantage of that. I mean, they're not awful. There is a little bit of creativity in their designs, and you do have to think at least a little bit to see how to dodge their attacks. But they tend to be slow and needlessly repetitive. They don't really give you an interesting challenge to learn, and unlike in the main levels, I didn't notice much of a sense of rhythm to them. It is super common for platformers to do a terrible job with bosses though, so this isn't really a big surprise. They brought back the race levels in this game, but while in Shattered Crystal they could be against pretty much any character, this time they're always against Eggman in one of his mechs. I love how abruptly they begin. Eggman always kidnaps Sonic without any warning to take him off to the track when you first unlock it, and then Sonic doesn't even have to break out or anything afterwards because Eggman just takes him back to where he was after getting beaten. It fits the tone of the TV show really well.
Save him! I was bringing him back, you nincompoop!
These races all take place on tracks that are, I think, purpose-built by Eggman himself. One of them has this section with springs that send you flying back in the wrong direction. I actually really like the idea of Eggman making booby-trapped tracks like this, that's hard to say, with boost pads that just slow you down and stuff like that to try and mess with Sonic. But sadly this concept only appears on this one track, they don't build on it as the races go on. Like with the challenge rooms, some of these are difficult enough to push you to learn the track's layout so you can win, while others are just a bit too easy to really be interesting. During my second playthrough of the game, which I did to record this footage, the last race level glitched out and Eggman just stood at the start line while I ran around the track. When I finished though, it told me that I'd lost. And then every time I tried to restart it, I just instantly lost as soon as it began. When I quit from the level, I found it had decided I'd completed it though, so it didn't block my progression, it was just funny to see. I think harmless glitches like this actually make the game more interesting, as long as they're not too common. While I was trying to figure out what on earth had just happened, I discovered that if you go back to a race level you've completed, you can race it as one of Eggman's robots. They all have slightly different stats. This one is so heavy it was actually hard to get around the track with it. The themes of the main levels in Fire and Ice are again based more around the Boom TV show than on the classic games. So for better or for worse, there is no Green Hill Zone in sight. Some of the areas have theming that I really enjoy, like this prehistoric jungle with all these dinosaur bones for you to run on. I especially like its later levels like Tar Pit Depths, where the dark, moody blue and purple stone in the foreground is contrasted with the gentle orange of the evening sky. I like how the music complements this area as well. Some of the later theming though ends up feeling like it doesn't quite go all the way. For instance, this is clearly supposed to be a pirate themed area, all the levels even have very piratey sounding names. But we're still in the freaking jungle. Jungle pirates? I know not every theme has to be based on some clearly recognizable stereotype, but this ends up just feeling like they couldn't be bothered to make a proper seaside background for it. Donkey Kong Country Returns did a much better job of its pirate-themed levels. They're set on the beach, and they make you deal with stuff like crab enemies, treasure chests, and even getting shot at with cannons. They go all out on the idea, while in Fire and Ice the pirate levels just feel like they're more jungle levels with a few old buildings thrown in. At least the level design here is good though, this was actually one of my favourite areas to play through. Also, visiting the characters in their houses is kind of weird in this game. In the previous game it felt slightly awkward when you visited Styx and she and Sonic just stood there in silence, but at least you understood why you were there and the point of the collectibles you were bringing to her. This one is quite a bit worse. Not only are they standing in complete silence, but you're delivering collectibles that don't even fit in with the game's plot, and there's more or less no explanation as to why you're doing it. What on earth does Styx have hiding under this bucket? Is it Frankenstein or something? And while in Shattered Crystal I only had this issue with Styx' house, in this game almost all of the characters are like this.
Are you my mummy?
The only one who's not quite as bad is Knuckles, who you get to see actually interact with Sonic a little bit. And since they're looking at these trading cards, the fact that they're silenced doesn't feel quite so strange. But for some reason, he lives in Tails' workshop now, and Tails has moved to some other workshop? Why is it like this? I kept seeing a pop-up after beating certain levels saying that I've unlocked a bot racer so I should visit Tails, But it took me ages to work out that his new workshop is in this random spot on the map. The bod races are what you play as when you replay those Eggman race levels I mentioned before, and there's also a multiplayer feature, which unfortunately I can't showcase for you guys as I've only got one copy of the game. Oh, and I suppose I should also tell you about the whole fire and ice gimmick the game is named after. I almost forgot to mention that. You basically just press the shoulder buttons to switch between fire, which you use to melt ice blocks you come across, and ice, which you use to freeze water. It's not very interesting. It would almost be a stretch to call it a mechanic. You pretty much just press the shoulder button when it tells you to, and then carry on. It does actually add a little bit to the game though. These moments often come up quite suddenly, so you've got to pay attention so you can press the button in time to clear the blockage or make a platform, and occasionally you have to actually think a little about whether or not you want a water block to be frozen. It's not really noteworthy, but the game is a little better for having it. Also, my apologies if you can hear the wind screaming out there. Shattered Crystal was a pretty short game, and Fire and Ice was even shorter. It only took me about 7.5 hours to beat it on my first playthrough, and that included all of the optional Tails levels. It's a solid little platformer, and it has a really nice sense of flow to it, but I think it plays it a little bit too safe. Shattered Crystal might have been a bit more rough around the edges, but for someone who really enjoys what it was going for, it was overall a more satisfying experience and more unique as well. Even so, I'm really glad that we did get this sequel. I guess it's not exactly a must-play, but if you like the Sonic Boom TV show, you'll probably appreciate getting to play through one of their adventures as an actual decent game. And I'd also recommend it if you're looking for a platformer that's easy enough that you can just sit back and relax with it, while still being good fun and asking for a little bit of concentration. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about this game. Thank you so much for watching all the way through this review. And as ever, don't forget to dislike and unsubscribe. And don't you dare leave a comment down below, you absolute